"Ma'am, you're going to need to step back from the street." The officer's voice cut through the late afternoon air, sharp enough to turn heads, but calm enough to sound routine. And yet something in the tone made people pause, made conversations fade, made the small stretch of Maple Avenue feel tighter than it should have on a warm day, just past 80 degrees, as Evelyn Carter stood there with a tray of freshly baked peach pies balanced carefully in her hands. The scent of cinnamon and sugar still rising in the heat, her fingers lightly dusted with flour, her posture steady despite the years etched gently into her shoulders. 68, and still moving with purpose, still showing up every Saturday just outside the old brick church where she had spent decades feeding anyone who needed it. No questions asked, and she turned her head slowly toward the officer, her expression not fearful but quietly confused, as if trying to understand how a simple walk across the street had turned into something heavier, something public, something that now drew a small circle of onlookers who didn't step closer but didn't leave either, their eyes flickering between the badge on his chest and the woman in front of him. Because everyone could feel it, that invisible line between authority and dignity stretching thinner by the second, and the officer, Ryan Blake, stood tall in his uniform, his stance firm, his jaw set in a way that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question, used to control, used to being the final word in situations like this. And yet Evelyn didn't raise her voice, didn't argue. She simply shifted the tray slightly in her hands, adjusting the weight as one of the pies tilted from the uneven curb. And in that small movement, there was something almost fragile but not weak, something steady, something grounded, and she spoke, her voice soft but clear enough to carry. "I was just heading over to the church, officer, and it wasn't a defense, not really, more like a statement of truth offered without resistance." And the air seemed to hold on to her words for a moment, like even the passing cars slowed just enough to listen, and behind them someone lifted a phone. Not aggressively, just instinctively, as if documenting something they didn't yet understand but knew mattered. And another person shifted their weight, uncertain, wanting to step in but not sure how, because moments like this didn't come with instructions. They came with tension, with silence, with that uneasy feeling that something important was happening just beneath the surface. And Evelyn lowered her gaze briefly to the pies, checking them as if they still mattered, as if keeping them intact was somehow part of keeping everything else intact too. And then she looked back up, meeting the officer's eyes not with defiance, but with something far more disarming, a calm that didn't match the situation, a patience that felt older than the moment itself. And for a split second, barely noticeable, something shifted in the space between them, not enough to change what had already begun, but enough to make the silence heavier, enough to make the crowd lean in just a little more, beginning to press against the edges. And she adjusted it gently, almost instinctively, like a habit formed from decades of caring for things that could easily fall apart if handled too roughly. And behind her the church doors stood half open, the faint echo of a choir rehearsal drifting into the street, soft voices layered over one another, creating a quiet contrast to the silence gathering here. And someone in the crowd took a step forward then stopped, unsure of where they belonged in this moment, unsure if stepping in would help or make things worse. And a young man near the curb lowered his phone for a second before raising it again, his expression uncertain, as if he was not just recording but searching for meaning in what he was seeing. And Evelyn finally spoke again, her tone unchanged, still steady, still calm. "These will get cold if I stand here too long." And it was such a simple statement that it almost slipped past the weight of everything else, but it landed differently than expected, not as a complaint, but as a quiet reminder that life continued even in moments like this, that there were still people waiting, still small acts of kindness that mattered. And Officer Blake's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger exactly, but in something closer to discomfort, like the situation was no longer unfolding the way he had anticipated, like the script had shifted without his permission. And he glanced briefly at the growing crowd, at the phones, at the eyes. Undeniable, as if something just beyond the edge of the scene was beginning to move closer, something that would not raise its voice or rush its steps, but would change everything simply by arriving. The low hum of the approaching engine grew clearer, not loud but steady, the kind of sound that carried intention rather than urgency. And a dark SUV eased to a stop along the curb about 20 feet from where Evelyn Carter stood, its presence subtle, yet somehow commanding attention without demanding it, and a few heads in the crowd turned fully now. Curiosity replacing hesitation as the driver's side door opened with a soft click, and a man stepped out, tall, composed, dressed simply in a fitted, dark shirt and worn jeans. Nothing about him flashy, nothing about him loud. But there was a weight in the way he moved, a grounded stillness that did not match the tension of the moment, yet somehow anchored it. And he closed the door gently behind him, his eyes scanning the scene once, not hurried, not confused, just taking it in piece by piece, the scattered pies, the aluminum tray catching sunlight, the officer standing rigid, the quiet crowd holding its breath, and then his gaze found Evelyn, and everything else seemed to fade slightly around that single point of focus. And Evelyn noticed him too, not immediately reacting but softening in a way that was almost imperceptible, a shift in her shoulders, a quiet exhale she had not realized she was holding. And the man took a few steps forward, measured and deliberate, each one closing the distance without creating alarm, without raising his voice or drawing unnecessary attention. And Officer Blake turned slightly toward the movement, his posture adjusting, his expression tightening as he recalibrated, as if trying to place this new variable into a situation he had believed was already under control. And the man stopped a few feet away, not crossing into anyone's space, not making any sudden gestures, just standing there with a calm that felt earned, and for a brief second no one spoke. The only sound the faint rustle of leaves and the distant echo of the choir still drifting from the church, and then the man looked at Evelyn. Again, his voice low but steady. "Ma, are you all right?" And the word landed softly but carried through the silence like something solid, something that could not be ignored, and Evelyn gave a small nod, her lips pressing together in a gentle line, not to hide emotion but to hold it with dignity, and she answered, "I am fine, Marcus," her voice as calm as before, but now there was something else beneath it, something warmer, something connected, and a subtle ripple moved through the crowd as the name settled in, as people began to understand that this was not just a passerby, not just another witness. And Marcus Carter shifted his attention slowly to Officer Blake, not abruptly, not confrontationally, just a steady turn of the head, his eyes meeting the badge before the face, as if acknowledging the position before the person, and then lifting to meet the officer's gaze directly. And there was no anger in his expression, no raised voice, just a quiet intensity that made the space feel smaller, more focused, and the officer straightened slightly, his stance firm but no longer as certain as before, his eyes flicking briefly to the crowd and back. And in that exchange, silent and measured, something began to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could be felt by everyone watching, like the moment before a shift in the weather, when the air grows still and heavy and you know, without anyone saying it, that what comes next will not leave things the way they were. Marcus Carter did not move any closer, did not raise his voice, and that alone seemed to unsettle the balance that had existed moments earlier, because there was no aggression to react to, no outburst to control, only a quiet presence that carried its own kind of authority. And he let the silence sit for a second longer than most people would have been comfortable with, his eyes steady on Officer Ryan Blake, not challenging, not yielding, simply holding. And then he spoke, his tone even, measured. "I am trying to understand what happened here." And the words were simple, but they landed with weight, not as a question that demanded an answer, but as a statement that required honesty. And the officer shifted slightly, his hand brushing near his belt before settling again, his gaze tightening as he responded. She was in the roadway, creating a hazard, and the explanation sounded practiced, like something he had said before, something that usually ended conversations rather than opening them. But Marcus did not interrupt, did not dismiss it, he just listened, his head tilting almost imperceptibly as if weighing the words against what he could see right in front of him, the scattered pies, the aluminum tray, the quiet crowd, and Evelyn, still holding herself with calm dignity despite everything. And Marcus nodded once, slow and deliberate, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. And then his eyes moved briefly to the ground, to one of the pies resting near the curb, its crust cracked, the filling beginning to seep slightly in the heat. And he bent down, not hurried, not dramatic, simply reaching out, and lifting it carefully with both hands as if it still mattered, as if it was worth preserving even now. And he placed it gently back onto the tray his mother held, adjusting it so it would not slide again. And that small action seemed to ripple through the crowd more than any raised voice could have, because it shifted the focus, it reframed the moment. It reminded everyone watching what was actually at stake here. Not control, not authority, but respect. And Marcus straightened again, brushing a faint trace of flour from his fingertips. And when he looked back at the officer, there was something clearer now in his expression, something more defined. And he said, "She has been bringing food to that church every Saturday for over 20 years. His voice steady, not accusing, just stating a truth that felt rooted and undeniable. And a murmur moved through the crowd, quiet but present, as a few people nodded, recognizing the routine, recognizing her. And Officer Blake's posture shifted again, more subtle this time, his shoulders tightening as the situation moved beyond a simple explanation, beyond something that could be closed with a single statement. And Marcus continued, not raising his volume, not stepping forward. If there was a concern, it could have been handled differently. And again, it was not said as an attack, but as a fact, something grounded in reason rather than emotion, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to push aside. And the sunlight caught the edge of the badge on the officer's chest, reflecting briefly into the eyes of someone filming from the sidewalk. And that person adjusted their stance, holding the phone steadier now, aware that this moment was no longer just an encounter. It was something unfolding, something that would be seen, something that would be remembered. And the space between the three of them grew quieter, heavier, as if waiting, as if the next word spoken would decide not just how this moment ended, but what it meant. Officer Ryan Blake's lips pressed into a thin line as the weight of Marcus Carter's words settled into the space between them. And for the first time since the moment began, there was a visible hesitation in the way he stood, not a retreat, but a pause, the kind that comes when certainty starts to crack just enough to let doubt in. And he glanced again at the growing circle of people, at the phones held steady, at the quiet attention that had replaced the earlier uncertainty, and it was no longer just a routine interaction. It was something being witnessed, something being measured in real time. And Evelyn Carter shifted the tray slightly in her hands, her fingers adjusting the balance once more, the faint warmth of the pies still rising into the air, mixing with the tension that refused to break. And she looked at Marcus briefly, her eyes soft, not asking for help, not signaling distress, just acknowledging his presence with the same calm she had held from the beginning. And Marcus gave the smallest nod in return, a silent reassurance that did not need words. And then his gaze returned to the officer, steady, patient, waiting without pressing, allowing space for the next choice to be made. And that space stretched, filled only by the distant hum of passing cars and the soft rustle of leaves along the sidewalk. And finally Officer Blake spoke again, his voice lower now, less rigid. "It is my responsibility to keep the street clear." And the statement hung there, not wrong, not aggressive, but no longer enough on its own. And Marcus listened without interrupting, his posture unchanged, and then he responded, just as evenly. "And it is all of our responsibility to treat people with respect." And the words were simple, almost quiet, but they carried a different kind of weight, one that did not rely on authority but on something deeper, something harder to dismiss. And a subtle shift moved through the crowd again, not loud, not dramatic, but present, as if people were recognizing something in that exchange, something that extended beyond this street, beyond this moment. And a woman near the front lowered her phone slightly, her expression softening, while another man nodded almost unconsciously. And Officer Blake's eyes flickered between Marcus and Evelyn, then briefly to the tray of pies. And for a moment it seemed like he might respond quickly, might try to regain control of the situation with another firm statement. But instead he paused again, longer this time, and the sunlight caught the edge of his badge once more, reflecting into the lens of a phone just a few feet away. And somewhere in the background, a car door closed, followed by the faint sound of footsteps approaching from the far end of the block, not rushed, not loud, but purposeful. And though no one had yet turned to look, there was a subtle awareness in the air, a sense that the moment was no longer contained to just the people already standing here, that it was expanding, drawing in more than expected, and Marcus remained still, his presence unwavering, not escalating, not backing down, simply holding the line of dignity that had been drawn without force. And Evelyn adjusted one last pie on the tray, her movements careful, deliberate, as if preserving what could still be preserved mattered now more than ever. And in that quiet, in that tension, in that shared awareness, it became clear to everyone watching that what happened next would not just resolve a situation. It would reveal something far deeper about the choices being made in this moment. The approaching footsteps became clearer now, steady against the pavement, and a second patrol car rolled slowly into view from the far end of Maple Avenue, its presence quiet but unmistakable as it came to a stop a short distance behind Officer Ryan Blake. And two uniformed figures stepped out, their expressions neutral but alert, their eyes immediately drawn to the small gathering, to the phones, to the stillness that did not belong in an ordinary street interaction. And a subtle shift moved through the crowd as people adjusted their stance, some lowering their voices, others holding their breath, sensing that the moment had crossed an invisible threshold. And Officer Blake glanced over his shoulder, just for a second, but it was enough to break the rigid line he had been holding, enough to introduce something new into his posture, something less certain, less controlled. And when he turned back, the space between him and Marcus Carter felt different, not smaller, but heavier, as if more eyes now carried weight into the exchange. And Marcus remained still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression unchanged, not reacting to the arrival, not using it, simply allowing it to exist within the moment. And Evelyn Carter shifted her weight slightly, the tray still steady in her hands, her fingers now lightly brushing away a bit of flour from the edge, as if maintaining order in small ways mattered more than ever. And the faint sound of the choir from the church drifted out again, softer now, almost like a background to the silence that had settled over everything. And one of the newly arrived officers took a few steps closer, not rushing, not interrupting, just observing, his gaze moving from the scattered pies to Evelyn, then to Marcus, then finally to Officer Blake. And though no words were exchanged yet, there was an unspoken communication in that look, a question perhaps, or an assessment. And Officer Blake inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising just slightly before settling again. And when he spoke this time, his voice carried less edge, less force. There is no need for this to become a scene. And the words seemed aimed at the space itself rather than any one person. But Marcus answered just as calmly, his tone unchanged. It already is, and that quiet truth settled into the air with a weight that could not be pushed aside. And a man near the back of the crowd nodded faintly, while another adjusted his phone to capture the full frame, aware that something significant was unfolding not through action but through restraint, through presence, through the refusal to let dignity be overlooked. And the second officer stepped closer now, his voice measured, directed toward Blake. Everything all right here? And it was a simple question, routine in form but different in timing, because it came not at the beginning, but at a moment when everything had already been seen, already been felt. And Blake's response did not come immediately, his gaze shifting once more between Marcus and Evelyn, then briefly to the ground where the last pie rested near the curb, untouched. And for a second longer than expected, he said nothing. And in that silence, in that pause, it became clear to everyone watching that the control he had once held over this moment was no longer entirely his, that something had shifted beyond words, beyond position, into something deeper, something that could not be commanded, only revealed. The silence that followed the question did not feel empty. It felt full, dense with everything that had already happened and everything that had yet to be said. And Officer Ryan Blake stood there with the weight of multiple gazes pressing in from every direction, not aggressive but undeniable. And for the first time his posture shifted in a way that was no longer subtle, his shoulders easing just slightly, as if the rigid frame he had held was no longer sustainable. And the second officer waited, not stepping in, not taking over, just present, allowing the moment to reveal itself without interference. And Marcus Carter remained exactly where he was, steady and composed, his breathing even, his eyes calm but unwavering, not demanding an outcome, only holding space for truth. And Evelyn Carter adjusted her grip on the tray once more, her fingers now still, the small movements she had been making settling into quiet, as if even she could feel that something important was about to surface. And the final pie near the curb sat untouched, its crust catching the light in a way that seemed almost symbolic now. Something left behind, something waiting to be acknowledged, and Officer Blake's gaze drifted toward it for a brief second before returning to Marcus. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different, not weak, not defeated, but stripped of the sharp edge it once carried. "I may have handled this differently." And the words were simple, almost understated, but they landed with a clarity that cut through the tension more effectively than any raised voice could have. And a quiet shift moved through the crowd. Not applause, not reaction, just a subtle release of held breath, as if something unspoken had finally been named. And Marcus did not respond immediately. He did not nod or step forward. He simply let the words exist, let them settle, let them mean what they needed to mean without rushing to define them further. And Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, not in approval, not in forgiveness fully formed, but in recognition that something real had just been spoken, something that did not erase what had happened but acknowledged it in a way that mattered. And the second officer glanced briefly at Blake, then at the scene around them, and gave a small nod, not as a signal, but as an understanding, a quiet confirmation that the situation had shifted into something more grounded, more accountable. And Marcus finally spoke again, his tone as steady as before. "That matters." And it was not said as praise, not said as judgment, simply as truth, and the space seemed to breathe again, the tension loosening just enough to allow movement, to allow the moment to begin resolving itself without force, without escalation. And Blake looked down once more, this time not at the crowd, not at the badge, but at the ground, at the pie still resting near the curb, and he took a step toward it, slow and deliberate, as if the action carried more weight than it should. And as he bent down to pick it up, carefully, without haste, something quiet but powerful settled over everyone watching, not because of what was being done, but because of what it represented, a shift not in authority, but in awareness. And in that small, deliberate motion, the moment changed in a way that no one would forget. Officer Ryan Blake held the pie in his hands for a moment longer than expected, as if feeling its weight meant understanding something he had missed before. And the crust was slightly cracked, the warmth still faint beneath his fingers, and he looked at it not as an object, but as something personal, something that carried effort, time, care. And he stepped forward slowly, closing the distance between himself and Evelyn Carter, his movements no longer rigid but deliberate. And when he reached the tray, he placed the pie back carefully, adjusting it so it would not slide, mirroring the same quiet care Marcus had shown earlier. And that small act did not erase anything, but it shifted the air in a way that everyone could feel. And Evelyn watched him, her expression calm, her eyes steady, not seeking apology, not demanding anything, simply present in the moment as it unfolded. And Blake straightened, his gaze lifting to meet hers. And for a brief second there was no crowd, no cameras, no other officers, just two people standing in the same space. And he spoke, his voice low, measured. "Ma'am, I am sorry." And the words were not loud, not dramatic, but they carried something real, something grounded. And the silence that followed was different from before, no longer tense, no longer waiting, but open, allowing whatever came next to exist without pressure. And Evelyn did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, let them find their place, and then she gave a small nod. Not as a full resolution, not as a complete forgiveness, but as acknowledgement, as recognition that something meaningful had just occurred. And Marcus stood quietly beside her, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and he did not step in, did not speak, because there was nothing more that needed to be added. The moment had already spoken for itself. And the second officer glanced between them, then toward the crowd, his expression easing slightly as the situation moved toward calm. And one by one, people began lowering their phones, not because the moment was over, but because it had reached something deeper than spectacle, something that did not need to be captured to be remembered. And a faint breeze moved through the street again, lifting a trace of flour from the edge of the tray, carrying it into the sunlight where it shimmered briefly before disappearing. And Evelyn shifted the tray gently in her hands, the pies now settled, imperfect but intact, and she turned slightly toward the church, the open doors still waiting, the soft sound of voices continuing inside as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, and Marcus stepped beside her, not leading, not guiding, just walking with her, matching her pace as she began to move forward, and Officer Blake remained where he was, watching for a second longer, his shoulders no longer tense, his stance no longer fixed, and the badge on his chest caught the light once more, but this time it did not feel like a symbol of control. It felt like a reminder, something quieter, something heavier, something that would stay with him long after the street returned to normal. And as Evelyn and Marcus reached the sidewalk near the church steps, the space behind them slowly began to loosen, the crowd dispersing, the moment settling into memory, but not fading, because what had happened here was not just seen, it was felt, and that feeling lingered in the air like the last note of a song that refuses to disappear. The church doors creaked softly as Evelyn Carter stepped onto the worn wooden threshold, the faint scent of polished pews and old hymn books wrapping around her like something familiar, something steady, and the quiet choir inside never stopped, their voices continuing in gentle harmony, as if the world outside had not just shifted in a way that would linger long after the moment passed. And Marcus walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, his presence aligned with hers, matching her pace step for step, and as they moved down the aisle, a few heads turned, recognizing her, offering small nods, quiet smiles, the kind that carried respect without needing explanation, and Evelyn lowered the tray onto a long table near the front, adjusting each pie with the same care she always had, even now. Even after everything, her hands steady, her movements deliberate, and Marcus watched her for a moment, his eyes softening, not with relief exactly, but with something deeper, something rooted in knowing that this was who she had always been, long before this day, long before anyone was watching, and outside, through the open doors, the street had begun to return to its rhythm, cars passing, conversations resuming, the crowd dissolving into ordinary motion, but one figure remained still for a moment longer, Officer Ryan Blake standing near the curb, his gaze fixed not on the people leaving, not on the officers beside him, but on the space where everything had just unfolded, and the badge on his chest caught the fading sunlight again. But now it did not shine the same way. It felt heavier, quieter, like something that carried meaning beyond authority, something that required more than presence to uphold. And he exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders releasing in a way that did not come from control, but from realization. And one of the other officers spoke quietly beside him, words that did not carry far, but Blake only nodded, his attention still anchored to that moment, that line he had crossed without fully seeing it, and the quiet way it had been drawn back without force, without anger, just truth and presence. And inside the church, Evelyn stepped back from the table, her hands now still, the pies arranged, imperfect but whole, and she looked toward Marcus, her expression gentle, and she said softly, "They are still warm." And he gave a small smile, the kind that did not need to be wide to be real, and he nodded once. And for a second neither of them spoke, because nothing more needed to be said. The moment had already settled into something lasting, something that would not fade with the evening light. And as the choir's voices rose slightly, filling the space with a quiet strength, Marcus reached out and brushed a small trace of flour from his mother's sleeve, a simple gesture, almost invisible, but full of care. And outside, the last of the lights stretched across the pavement where a faint dusting of flowers still lingered near the curb, catching the glow before slowly disappearing into the evening air, leaving behind nothing visible, but everything understood.